It's great to be back here. Thank you for inviting me, especially to talk about the role of computation in my work. So for me, the integration of computational methods in thinking has been to play a central role in allowing me to experiment and speculate on our interactions with public data. And today I would like to share with you two projects, one older finished project and one that's very much ongoing still. 2 years into my PhD here, I found myself working for a summer in the newsroom at 538. And this experience pushed me to think very deeply about the perspective of readers who incorporate our work into their lives every single day as part of their daily diet of information. What I made at 538 that summer was a Twitter bot called Census Americans. It tweets the mini biography of a real person from the census every hour. And I had worked with census data and visualizations on numerous occasions prior to this, but in the new journalistic setting, I found that there was an opportunity to build relationships between our readers and census data that hadn't been there before. And I was able to also capitalize on the procedural language of bots, which is a kind of Mad Libs language we have all been long familiar with through getting spam. So the data I used in Census Americans was a subset of the census called the American Community Survey. This is a survey, mailed-in survey taken on a rolling basis of 1% of the American population every single year. The survey had roughly 40 questions each year, and each with multiple components covering 15 millions or rows of data, millions of people or rows of data. Each of these rows is a real person. And here's an example of one row from the year 2013, which is the data I used. So I chose some columns initially based on their content, and I reconstituted the data values using the original survey language so that each line from the previous slide became a paragraph. For each value, I then calculated a priority score based on the difference between the actual occurrence of that value and the proportional occurrence. Because in designing the content, I sought to treat every single person in the data set, but treat the most rare values of that person. I then sorted the sentences to that value, according to that value, and created the tweet by trimming it to length, which was 140 characters at the time. So to date, it's completed only a fraction of this population of tweets, but it's about 30,000 people, each with a very, very short bio. It did turn out that we don't need much of a descriptor for people to relate to complete strangers. And also, people started responding by describing themselves that way. But as I and others have continued to live with this data set in the form of the census bot, one thing I ended up learning over time reading these tweets is that Census Americans ended up being incredibly sad. And it's only over time that I started to understand fundamentally that disability, lack of education, unemployment, language barriers, death, and divorce, our vulnerabilities as individuals are in fact the things that are integral to the allocation of resources, which is what the census really is about. So the capacity to understand this underlying intention of data became clearer to me after this experience than it had after producing hundreds of maps of census data the year before. Today, a handful of companies have tremendous power to track and profile us as consumers. At the lab that I'm currently completing my postdoc, we work with the idea of how location data can be used to bring to light both infrastructural and informal issues in our cities. for my own work, the approach to this issue has been more from the experience of an individual and how I can get one person to engage with their own data as a company might and try to recast themselves as people rather than a segment of the market. Following this, I started to experiment with a few things that for me humanized census data, such as a visual search based on satellite photos of different segments of our population, as well as tools that allow you to use physical experiences to orient data, census demographics in our cities. And personally, I continued to experiment with a second bot that followed my phone's location and tweeted the census data of every place I had been, constantly profiling me through the census. And now, very much in progress is building an application for self-quantification through the census for others. I think there's a tremendous power in using self-quantification as a lens and a driver to understand environmental context. And I believe that individual filtering of census data or other public data sets even has the potential to foreground the idea that we're actors in this large data aggregate. And instead of being raw material that's harvested, there are ways, small ways, in which we can participate in large automated and coordinated recordings of our behavior. It may even be possible to learn about ourselves when we see the demographic boundaries of our daily physical experience, making aggregate data beneficial to personal knowledge. So I would like to end with just two ideas that's really been central in how I see computing practices has integrated into my work in art making. The first is the idea of changing our relationship with data sets, such as the census. Geographical intimacy refers specifically to the idea that one can relate to global phenomena, such as the movement of tectonic plates to the growth of your fingernails. If we can do that, it helps us to understand these large phenomena differently. We have a constant and very personal relationship with the data that's collected from us. It's personal, but it's also very, on the other hand, very transactional. There's a very thin line, in fact, between personalization and dehumanization when it comes to this data. I believe that there are opportunities to communicate data in ways that resist this kind of transactional relationship. And coupled with the idea of changing the nature of our relationship with data is the idea that of who gets to self-identify when it comes to aggregate data sets. Perhaps this is best exemplified by a story from the history of the census itself. Until 1970, the census was conducted by a team of census takers that visited each home and filled out census information by conducting an interview of the residents. However, in 1970, the census became, for the first time in history, self-enumerated, meaning that forms were filled out by citizens themselves, and mailed in. And when many Americans for the first time saw census forms and set pen to paper for the first time, some of them really struggled to categorize themselves. For example, one of the questions in the form asked relationship to household, head of household. Because no option was given for husband of household, married women for the first time saw that they were not able to self-identify as heads of their own households. So in the subsequent census of 1980, this option was actually changed on paper. Amid all the other changes that happens between one census to another, this might seem very insignificant. However, this is an example that tells the story of the difference between how we're counted and how we count ourselves. The way that Fox's work has been most influential for me is that it made me very highly aware of the fact that despite the necessity of existence of categorization and classification, that the formalization of categories is always going to be playing catch up to how we can define ourselves. And opportunities for self-identification in a large system like this moment in the census, it's very rare, but it does exist. Looking back at the work that my colleagues have done in the Media Lab and now at Columbia that continues to combine computation and art in amazing ways, I think creating these opportunities and moments of self-definition in a system, it's one of the essential ways that cross-disciplinary practices of art and computing can challenge a narrative of technological progress. So as the way we can understand data about ourselves change, perhaps we have relationships with data that can resist aggregation eventually, and may be a way for us as individuals to change the idea of ownership of these data sets. Thank you.